Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our final OSHA webinar of 2023. Just a few housekeeping items. If you have any issues with this webinar, if you get dropped, if you have connectivity issues, please reach out to us immediately so that we are aware of this. Also, if you were not able to list everyone who is sitting in on this webinar on the initial form, please reach out to us immediately following the webinar. Your credit for this webinar will be posted on your portal in 7 to 10 business days, as well as you will receive a form in the mail. If you have questions during the webinar, please type them in the question box and we will get to them at the end. I'd like to welcome our presenter, Kurt Rostad. Many of you may have remembered Kurt from years and years and years of doing OSHA training for us. He's retired. He is a licensed funeral director and embalmer with 50 years of funeral service experience, including being an employee, manager, funeral home owner, and consultant. He is also a nationally known speaker and seminar presenter on various aspects of funeral service, with his topics ranging from improving customer service to funeral home management, OSHA, and other compliance issues. Welcome back, Kurt.
Thank you very much, Kelly, and good afternoon, everyone. The voice probably sounds familiar because we've been together, as Kelly said, doing this many times. So this is going to be a review for a lot of you. So that's why it doesn't have to be any more than the hour seminar. This, of course, is billed as an employee training session. This is not meant to be a full-on OSHA compliance seminar for owners and managers. This is for employees. We're required to do this on an annual basis by OSHA regulation. Much of what we do this afternoon will be very familiar to you. Yes, there'll be some pictures, and I hope you can stay awake from it. To begin, I'd like to just review with you, maybe for the owners more than the employees, that OSHA has always had an image problem, that it's a lot of paperwork, it's a lot of compliance work, it's a lot of time involved. I can't totally disregard that, but a lot of the paperwork that I see funeral homes doing is not because necessarily of OSHA, but some of the paid consultants out there that are doing OSHA compliance for you, in their attempt to show you what a thorough job they're doing, they weigh you down with more paperwork than what you need. I'll even have an example as we go on. The second image problem is that they're out to get you. Nothing could be further from the truth. They are not coming after funeral directors. They're not there to shut you down. True, the fines are amazing. This is an old photo showing you that a repeated willful violation could carry a fine as much as $170,000. That has been changed and it's indexed for inflation, so it's up to $156,259 for a repeated willful violation. I want to start right at the beginning by saying that no funeral home in the history of the world has ever been fined anywhere close to that. So if your compliance person is trying to scare you into signing up or staying with them by throwing these numbers at you, you need to know that that's very unrealistic and really isn't in the cards for a normal funeral home. You are not being targeted by OSHA. You're pretty far down on the list. There have been a couple of states that have made a concerted effort to inspect funeral homes looking for compliance with bloodborne pathogens and so on. But those days have pretty much passed. We're not seeing that again. And there's bigger fish to fry. People are getting hurt in a lot of other industries, a lot more than funeral service. And that's where they focus their inspections. So what I would like you to do, owners and managers, is to kind of get a happy balance here. I don't want you to be complacent. I don't want you to blow off OSHA. At the same time, I don't want you to be paranoid thinking that OSHA is going to walk in the door at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning and shut down your funeral home. Neither one is realistic. We want to see you complying with OSHA, making a good faith effort to be in compliance, And what we're doing here today for your employees is exactly that, is helping you stay in compliance. OSHA is not a deal where you go out and buy a program and put it on the shelf and tell everyone there, we're in OSHA compliance. OSHA is an ongoing process because safety is an ongoing process. So if you look in your handout on page 2, again, emphasizing that this is for employees, there are a few things that we cannot do by seminar. There's some things that have to be done in your funeral home, and there's a list here on page 2 of the handout where your employer, for instance, needs to show you your exposure control plan for your business. Now, we're going to review one, or what's the elements of one, during our training today, because that's mandated by OSHA, but the actual one in your funeral home, you need to have reviewed with you. I'll remind employers that that has to be reviewed on an annual basis and brought up to date. Many years ago, we just kind of declared that October starting with an O and OSHA starting with an O, October was OSHA month. So kind of put on your calendar that this is the month to not only get this training, but it's also the month of the year to review your compliance materials that have a 1-year date on them and make sure they're still up to date. If nothing has changed, it's as simple as adding a cover sheet or signing it, dating it that you reviewed it. It's up to date and you're good to go. Then turn to page 3 of the outline. And you will see at the top of the page a place for employees to put your name, the name of your employer, today's date. We want you to sign it as proof that you attended this. Now, this has nothing to do with continuing ed. Kelly mentioned that to you. This has to do with an OSHA inspection. When we're done today, you should take this packet to your employer, have him show you those 4 items on the previous page, check them off that that's been completed. Then he should take this section and keep it for 3 years. The employers are required to keep training records for 3 years on each employee. So this is his proof in the event of an OSHA inspection that he provided the training for you. That's why he is going to collect this rather than you keeping it yourself. So we're ready to start our training today by talking about general workplace safety. There's no annual requirement for that, but it is the heart of OSHA. It's where it all began. General workplace safety, as the name implies, is not specific to funeral homes. It applies to virtually every workplace in the country, and it talks about general safety things like fire extinguishers or ladders or exits and entrances and all those sorts of things. It doesn't require specific paperwork, but you have to have a program in place that involves management commitment to safety, and it requires employee involvement. We'll talk about that later on. It also requires something called worksite analysis, a fancy OSHA term to simply mean, let's go through the funeral home and look for things that need attention from a safety standpoint. Every funeral home has some downtimes, and this would be a good time to just look for stuff and make lists that when you have the opportunity, you've got time, go ahead and fix them, because that's the next step. Hazard prevention and control. When you see something that needs to be fixed, fix it. It can be a simple thing like an overused outlet. It could be a tripping hazard on carpet. I like to use that as an example because that not only is a safety hazard for employees, it's a potential lawsuit from a visitor in the funeral home. And yet I've seen those types of things, a rumple in the carpet or a tear in the carpet. It's one of those things, yeah, we need to get to that someday. And the someday is usually 2 days after you get sued because somebody tripped on it. So that's the kind of thing we want you constantly doing, is just looking for things that could be a problem. The 4th part of general workplace safety is safety and health training. It doesn't require annual training, but new employees are required to have training on simple things like where are the fire exits, where is the OSHA materials kept, what programs you have in place for employee safety. I want to make a special mention of distracted driving, and we automatically think of texting and driving. There are about 6 billion text messages sent every year. Too many of them are sent or read while the person is behind the wheel of a car. In fact, 3,000 car deaths per year are due to distracted driving, not just texting, but playing with the sound system, trying to read a map or look at the GPS, or being distracted by the kids in the back seat, whatever it is. 3,000 deaths a year. If you're on your cell phone, not texting, just on your cell phone, you have a slower reaction time than a person who is legally drunk. A sobering statistic, you must admit. And so 2 things we recommend employers that you have within your OSHA materials, a policy against distracted driving, and also in your employee handbook, you should have a section in there specifically forbidding the use of the phones, texting, and so on while the vehicle is in operation. I have no idea what that's all about. So we quickly move on to the next major section of OSHA, which is called hazard communication. It means the employer is required to communicate the hazards of the workplace to the employees. Thus the name. It does require a written program, and it basically deals with the use of chemicals. Now, when we think of chemicals, we immediately think of formaldehyde in the in the prep room, but there's a lot of other places that we see hazardous chemicals in a typical business, including a funeral home. It's the paints and chemicals stored out in the garage. It could be the cleaning materials in the hall closet. There's a lot of different opportunities here. Some of you have weed killers and so on to take care of the lawn. All of those could be considered hazardous chemicals, and there's rules to go along with it. As I said, there's a written program that's required. There are labeling requirements. Those labels were changed here a few years back. They were greatly improved, putting more information on the labels. MSDSs became a thing of the past. They were replaced with something called the SDS, basically the same thing, a safety data sheet instead of a material safety data sheet. Big deal, they changed the name. Well, no, they also changed the layout of those documents by significantly. There's training involved in the safe handling of chemicals and also the use of personal protective equipment to protect you when you're handling chemicals. And there's also requirements in the program as to how to handle a spill. Now, we mentioned the labels before, and we've gone through this in past years. We're not going to do that this year. We've done it plenty of times. Just a reminder that they have changed significantly. They have these little pictograms now to give you a visual first hit as to what type of a chemical you're dealing with. The label itself contains a signal word to show you how dangerous the chemical is, and of course has the pictogram. It also has some precautionary statements or basic information on the chemical. Just from the label, you get a lot of information on how dangerous the chemical is that you're dealing with. A huge improvement over the old way of doing things. And this melds together very nicely with the new SDS sheets that are tied to the labels like they never were before. And they are all standardized as opposed to the MSDS sheets that all look so different. You spent some time hunting for information. Here, there's some standardization to be had, much easier to scope out the information that you need. Now, the only bad hit that I've heard on the SDS sheets is they are much more thorough now. They used to be just one page front and back. Now I'm hearing of SDS sheets that are, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14 pages long. And people say, how do we keep all this stuff? First of all, the rules have not changed. You only need SDS sheets on hazardous chemicals. That's the way it's always been. What has changed is with the new labeling and the new SDS sheets, it's much easier to determine if something truly is a hazardous chemical. Many of them will say right on it, either on the product label or on the SDS sheet, that this product is considered non-hazardous for OSHA compliance purposes. So the SDS sheet is not something you are required to keep. Now, if you have a lot of this product around and you're still concerned about it or want to keep the information, that's fine, but you're not required to. The second thing that might help you is that you are not required to keep these in a 3-ring binder or binders. You can store them electronically. You can put them on a tablet or a laptop or whatever. There's some caveats to that, of course, is first of all, that laptop or tablet must be available to the employees. It can't be the boss's desktop unit in his locked office. It has to be available to them. And of course, each employee must know how to operate it. I have a couple of folks that took an outdated iPad, took all the other apps off of it, and basically you turn it on, it's the only app you can hit. It's a storage document app that stores nothing but the safety data sheet, so it's pretty much foolproof. That works well as long as you keep it charged, plugged in, so that it is always available. So if you can do those a few things and maybe even have 2 or 3 of them available, then you don't have to have the bulky 3-ring binders. Just a note about chemical storage. This is mostly paint, as you can see, but there's some other stuff here. And this, I did not take this in a funeral home, but it could be. I know a lot of funeral homes that have a shelf like this in the garage or the back room with all kinds of stuff. First of all, it looks a little messy. Those paints are only good for a couple of years. You're better off taking a picture of the label and storing that if you need to get the paint. It's probably no good after a while. Looks like just about everything is labeled, however, except for if you look in the middle, and I don't know if my arrow's showing up on your screen, but right in the middle is this Folgers coffee can. I'm going to bet that there is no Folgers coffee in there. So whatever's in there is mislabeled, and that's automatically an OSHA violation. Unless, of course, what's in there is nuts and screws and bolts. But if there's any chemical in there, they maybe used it as for paint thinner to clean a brush or something, that would be a violation. So make sure that anything that you do have stored is in its proper container. The next section we talk about is the formaldehyde standard. This is still a part of hazard communication. It's just that there are certain chemicals that are so dangerous they have their own special regulations. Formaldehyde is one of them, and that should be a clue to us that this stuff is something that we do not treat lightly. The first requirement of the OSHA standard for formaldehyde is to have exposure determination and monitoring. I'm sure you're all familiar with this. I assume your employer has done it, where you tested for the exposure to formaldehyde. You had a little monitor put on you or one of your coworkers. There's an 8-minute or a 15-minute test and an 8-hour test. And you have to be below certain limits to pass. Not everyone needs to be tested. It has to be a representative sample of the employees. So if there's 2 of you, you only have to test 1. Even if there's a group of you, as long as you're basically all doing the same thing, testing 1 of you is fine. One of the questions I frequently get, I'll answer it now, is do you have to test every year? No, there is no set time or requirement to retest. This is a one and done thing, unless you change something that is likely to produce a different test result. So as long as your prep room stays the same and you're still using the same types of chemicals and you have the same types of employees, it doesn't have to be redone. Now, if you put in a new exhaust system, do major remodeling in there, then yes, you would retest to see that you haven't changed anything and the results are the same or even better. The next big thing I want to remind you of, employers, is that this has to be, the results need to be available to the employees. In the event of an OSHA inspection, you can pretty well assume that the inspector will take employees aside. They might choose one to accompany them on their inspection, and they will ask them questions. and he's almost derelict in his duty if he doesn't come up with this one. Did your employer test for formaldehyde, and what were the results? And you get to stand back and not answer and hope that your employee says, yes, we did that about a year ago or 2 years ago or whatever. And I don't remember the numbers, but I know we passed and the results are right there. And he points to the bulletin board. Now, there's no requirement that you post it, don't misunderstand, but I recommend that you post it so everybody remembers where it is in the event of an inspection. The second copy should be in your OSHA compliance materials, and it's certainly okay for your employee to say that in his answer. If he or she simply says, the results are in the OSHA book upstairs, that's fine, but you need to show that you shared those results with your employees. The second section of the formaldehyde standard is called engineering and work practices. Another fancy OSHA term that simply means we're going to alter the way we work and use engineering or equipment to minimize our exposure to formaldehyde. In simple terms, it means we're going to turn on the exhaust system. We're going to watch how we work with formaldehyde. I'm going to recommend to you that to minimize your exposure to formaldehyde, you should be using a drain hose connected to a drain tube. I know some of you like to just stick in a forceps and let it go. Not a great idea because you're being exposed to the fumes of the formaldehyde in the drainage, and you're making a mess with blood too, which we're going to talk about in a while. So let's eliminate two hazards at once by cleaning up the way we do things using the drain tube. Simple things like putting the cover on the embalming machine. It sounds so simple, but that's where the formaldehyde fumes first enter the room, is when you pour that into the machine, fill it up with water, and fumigate the whole room and run the exposure to formaldehyde out. You don't need that, so let's not do it. Your employer is required to provide personal protective equipment to you. They're required to show you how to use it. It has to be in sizes that work for everyone. If you've got a physically small lady embalmer who wears a size 6 glove, and you've got a huge male embalmer that wears a size 10 glove, you're not allowed to just get a size 7 and tell everybody to make them work. You've got to get stuff that meets the requirements of all your employees. It's not a big deal. Also, how to dispose of properly. These are one-use things, you throw them away and so on. In the event of an emergency, how do we clean up a spill? Now, a simple spill, it's real simple. Your formaldehyde standard paperwork will say, get a rag and wipe it up. It's that simple. Just don't let the rag lay there and fumigate the room. We're going to either rinse it out or put it in a bag and seal it so it doesn't fumigate the room. In a case of a larger spill, the worst disaster I guess we could have in a funeral home is to drop 24 bottles in a case of high index cavity fluid on the floor, and they all pop open, and you've got all that formaldehyde on the floor of the embalming room. The law says that you will not endanger your health. Your employer will not endanger the health of an employee by having them clean up a major spill. And so your formaldehyde standard paperwork should say, and that we call the experts on that, it's called the fire department, it's the hazmat group. They've got all the fans, exhaust systems, respirators, everything they need to clean up the spill, and we let them do it. The last part of the formaldehyde standard is not a part of hazard communication. It's kind of unique here. It says that if you're showing the effects of formaldehyde contamination, an allergy, a sensitivity, you have the right to medical care. That's what they mean by medical surveillance. And if it's found that you have an allergy to formaldehyde, that you can't be around this stuff, you are to be removed from that exposure. So you would not be allowed in the embalming room. It sounds like a pretty tough decision, but your health is important, and this stuff can only get worse if you have that sensitivity. So we want to get you out of being exposed to formaldehyde. most of these pictures I've shown you before. They're humorous. Yes, you're allowed to snicker at them. But I do want to say that some of these are not taken in the United States. You might be able to detect that. I feel sorry for some of these employees who are forced to work in conditions that I guess we could call them third world, where their employers care less about their safety and they're doing the best they can to protect themselves on their own. But, you know, some of them are just, you know, well, you decide. Anybody who knows about hydraulics knows that you pop a hose right now, you're gonna have a problem. Everything's under pressure. A rock is holding the tire in place. Let's hope those 4x4s don't slide away, or 2x4s, whatever they are, and he's welding on the gas tank. If you can't see that, he's lighting a cigarette. I kind of mentioned this earlier. Yours may not look this bad, but if you're overloading an outlet, if any of those wires are warm to you, you are getting yourself set up for a fire hazard, because those wires are going to get hot, and if they get hot behind the wall and they start a fire, your funeral home is going to be a statistic. Let me just recommend to you that if you have anything approaching looking like this, you need to know, don't add a bar, but add another outlet on a different circuit. Yeah, it's going to mean calling an electrician. It's going to cost a couple $100, but it's going to be a lot safer than whatever they have going on here. Lifting a forklift with a forklift. This obviously has nothing to do with OSHA. This is just some clowns, but I just thought it was kind of interesting. Creative solution that's going to get someone hurt. This is the first one that I'm going to just tell you, this is obviously not in the United States. To prevent getting chips of metal in his eye, he's using a plastic bag over his face. I have no idea how he breathes. This is a barefoot person on a metal ladder inside of a pool of water using an electric drill. What could go wrong? But hey, he's got his goggles on. Another inventive way to keep welding sparks from burning your face. At least he's got his hard hat on. It's one of my favorites. That's a cigarette in his mouth. I don't see any blue label on that blue container there. God only knows what's in there. What ones of these chemicals could cause a fire or an acid burn if they mix together? Have no idea, but this is not considered a safe chemical storage. And this is my all-time favorite. I take a moment for it to sink in. So we're on page 4 of our outline, and we're going to talk about bloodborne pathogens. I think we're all familiar with the diseases that we're talking about, including HIV for AIDS, HPV, hepatitis B. COVID was an airborne disease, so it was not covered by bloodborne pathogens. TB is not covered by bloodborne pathogens. In fact, there is no airborne disease regulation. It's been talked about. But while we're at it, let's make steps to prevent ourselves from collecting germs, bacteria, and viruses that are in the air that can also bring disease to us. So we're going to concentrate on bloodborne pathogens, but a lot of these things will also apply when we're dealing with airborne. So the bloodborne pathogen standard is something that we're going to go through now because that's one of the requirements. So if you would turn back to page 15 in your outline. And hoping that your printer printed it out in the same page breaks as the original, you should be looking at a page that says at the top, Regulation Standard 29 CFR Bloodborne Pathogens 1910.1030. Everyone find that? Page 15. Now this is the bloodborne pathogen rule. This is the actual law that we're dealing with when it comes to bloodborne pathogens. It contains what is required to have in your exposure control plan. So we're required to go through this with you, but we're going to kind of kill two birds with one stone. We're going to go through this and show you what you need to do to comply with bloodborne pathogens in your funeral home, but also what is going to be in this exposure control plan that your employer has created and is going to be sharing with you when this session is over with. So to begin this regulation, like all good government regulations, it begins with scope and application. What does this rule have to do with? And it says occupational exposure to blood or other potentially infectious materials. So right away we know that it includes more than blood. We'll get to that. Because the next thing is definitions. They define some of the terms that we'll find in this regulation. The first one I want to bring to your mind is the word contaminated. It says the presence or reasonably anticipated presence of blood or other potentially infectious material. So even if a sheet is white, clean, dry, no stains, it could still be considered contaminated if you're told that a body had been wrapped up in it, because we could reasonably anticipate that it is contaminated with some bloodborne pathogen. Next page, middle of the page, 16, we finally define other potentially infectious material. And it says the following human body fluids. Now we're going to stop right there and say, we're not going to try to determine as a practical matter, what is that human body fluid we're looking at? We're just going to say all human body fluids. We're going to say, we're going to consider them infectious rather than to try to determine which one they are. So all human body fluids will be considered potentially infectious. And then unfixed tissues or organs that we would come in contact with maybe during an autopsy or an accident situation, that would also be included. So it could be a clear liquid, it could be an organ, or it could be blood. There's a lot more involved in bloodborne pathogens than red liquid blood. Regulated waste is talked about on the bottom of page 16. A lot of confusion here because this is different than contaminated. If you have a sheet that is contaminated, you can throw it in a laundry bag and you would mark it with a biohazard label and you would handle it accordingly. You could either send it to a commercial laundry or you could do it in-house. It does not necessarily have to go into that marked red barrel or whatever it is that they provided by your contaminated waste hauler or regulated waste hauler who likes to haul this stuff out by the pound and is sending you huge bills every month to do this. You're throwing a lot of stuff in there, I'm guessing, that doesn't have to be in there. For instance, when it comes to blood, let's say there's blood on a sheet. To be regulated, you'll see it says liquid or semi-liquid blood that would be released from the item, from the sheet, if compressed. In other words, if you wring it out, there's so much blood in it that it would drip out. That makes it a sheet that would be considered regulated. Or if it's dried, does it flake off? Then it would be regulated. You would put it in that hazard bin. Otherwise, it could be laundered either in-house or out of house. So you be careful what you're throwing in that big barrel and hauling it off by the pound. Just because it's refuse from the prep room doesn't mean it has to go in there. Universal precautions. It is an approach to infection control where all human blood, and it says certain body fluids, we're going to say all human body fluids, are treated as if known to be infectious for HIV, HPV, and other bloodborne diseases. So, universal precaution says is we treat everyone as if they are contaminated. We treat everything that has come in contact with the body as contaminated. We consider all human body fluids to be contaminated, and we're going to treat them accordingly. We're going to use the PPE. We're going to use engineering and work practices that minimize our exposure to bloodborne pathogens. Now, we're going to be using some of the same terminology here that we used in hazard communication because the PPE, for instance, does double duty. It protects us from the chemical known as formaldehyde, and it protects us from the liquid called blood. So a lot of this is an overlap. You don't have to have different kinds of gloves for both formaldehyde and blood. We're using the same types of stuff. Now on the bottom of 17, it starts talking about the exposure control plan. This is the document that your funeral home must have, and the one that your employer has to share with you, and we're going to go through what has to be in it. Now, we assume your employer has one. He's gotten it up to date. He or she is going to share it with you at the end of this session, but this is going to be a review of generally what has to be in it for it to comply. So very quick review. Turn on to page 18. About 3/4 of the way down, it talks about exposure determination. And the first thing on the list there is job classifications. It has to contain a list of the job classifications that have exposure. Now, you don't have to put individual names, just their job titles. So that would be removal personnel, embalmers, interns, or apprentices, whatever term you prefer. Maybe housekeeping if they go in the prep room to clean. That's probably it. That's your list. The next thing that it has to contain is a list of the tasks that are performed that create the exposure. So again, not too hard. Removal of remains, transfer of remains, embalming of remains, cleaning up after remains. There you go. It's not that hard. Methods of compliance, page 19 at the very top. Universal precautions shall be observed. There you go. That should be a sentence in your exposure control plan. Engineering and work practice controls, I just mentioned that. It talks about how we're going to protect ourselves. And you'll notice the word hand washing appears several times in the next few lines. Yes, the first rule of compliance with bloodborne pathogens is wash your hands. And your employer must provide you with proper hand washing facilities. Towels, sink, water, soap, well, that's tough stuff. This OSHA compliance stuff maybe isn't as difficult as some people like to make it think. Contaminated needles and contaminated sharps, it talks about handling of those on page 19, about 3/4 of the way down. And then on page 20, about an inch or so down, it says eating, smoking, drinking, applying cosmetics, or handling the contact lenses is prohibited in the work area. Now, to us, the work area means the embalming room. Bear in mind, this was written for everybody who has exposure to bloodborne pathogens. So it means you can't eat, smoke, or drink in the prep room. That's not too hard, and it was gross anyway. Food or drink can't be kept in the body cooler. That I think we can live with that. Next one, all procedures involving blood will minimize splashing, spraying, spattering, and generation of droplets. So what are we talking about here? We're back to using the drain tube. We talked about it for formaldehyde protection. Now we're talking about it for blood. We don't want to let things run to the end of the table and drop down in the sink where it can atomize and go throughout the room. We want to run a hose down to the drain so we don't have exposure to this. Page 21, personal protective equipment. In general, it's going to talk to us about the fact that your employer is required to provide you with appropriate personal protective equipment. And as we mentioned earlier, when we were talking about formaldehyde, correct sizes, things that don't allow blood to soak through. So cloth gowns are out. That doesn't work because it'll soak through your skin or your outer clothing. It talks about cleaning, laundering, and disposal, about 3/4 of the way down on page 21. Yes, you can do it in-house. You can get a decontamination unit and do your sheets and whatever in-house. That's called a washing machine. That's perfectly legal. Add some good detergent and add some bleach. They're going to come out just fine. If they're so soaked that you can squeeze blood out of them, they go in the bin and are hauled away at so much a pound. But we shouldn't see that often. You shouldn't be hauling that kind of stuff away from the hospital in the first place, because now you're transporting hazardous waste and you don't have a license to do that. So whenever possible, take as little stuff with you from the hospital as you can. Leave the rest of the stuff in the hospital for them to dispose of their own stuff. Page 22 at the top talks about gloves as one of the personal protective equipment items. Obviously, there's two kinds. There's the disposable one-use type. There's also the heavy utility gloves or autopsy gloves, whatever you call them. Yes, you can disinfect those and reuse them as long as they're intact. Page 22, about 3/4 of the way down, talks about masks, eye protection, and face shields. Thing I want to mention here is eyeglasses are not eye protection. That doesn't work. Get yourself a mask of some time, and yes, there are some good masks that don't fog up. You just have to do a little experimentation until you find the one that works for you. Body clothing, protection, aprons, and gowns are talked about at the bottom of that page. Top of page 23 talks about housekeeping. Yes, cleaning up afterwards can be just as dangerous as the operation itself. And one of the items I want to point out to you that's contained in this regulation at the top of the page is that you must implement a written schedule for cleaning. This is where some of the compliance companies go astray And to show you how thorough they are, they also provide you with a cleaning log that they expect you to record when you've cleaned according to your cleaning schedule. That's not a good idea. First of all, let's talk about the cleaning schedule. OSHA requires that you clean up at a couple obvious places. If you have an immediate spill, hose comes off, whatever, you're required to clean up that mess immediately. That just makes common sense. You're also required to clean up at the end of the operation, or in the event that you're a huge firm that you just go from one case to the next all day long, clean up at the end of the shift. And then you are to put that schedule out for use, telling people when you do that. And you may have a schedule that says that we periodically mop the floor, whether it needs it or not, or we do this or we do that. Be real careful when you create the schedule that you can live with it, okay? Because you'll be expected to follow it. Now, here's what happens if you do a cleaning log, and this is why it's dangerous to do that, because OSHA does not require you keep a cleaning log. Some of the consultants think that's a good idea to show that you're doing what you're doing. Here's what can happen. Let's suppose that you say, we will mop the floor of the prep room on a weekly basis on Wednesdays. And you haven't had a call in all week, so you don't see a need to mop the floor, so you don't do it. And the OSHA inspector comes in and says, I see you mop your floor every week on Wednesday, and yet today is Friday, and there's no mark here on your cleaning log that you mop the floor. Therefore, you're in violation of your cleaning schedule, and he can fine you for that. Did you see what just happened? You got fined for not doing following a rule that you created. You don't want that. If you're going to get fined for something, let it be an OSHA regulation, not our funeral home regulation. So first of all, make a schedule you can live with. Don't be that specific, and don't record that you do it. We have a cleaning schedule that we do this and this and this. Maybe it says as needed. It doesn't have a specific day or date on it, and you don't record when it's done. Just make sure the place is clean. He won't have a problem with the fact that you've got a cleaning schedule and the place is clean. If it's a mess, you might get a fine anyway. Regulated waste is talked about on page 23. We've mentioned it. We're not going to go through all this again. It talks about the regulated waste container on page 24. It talks about laundry on page 25. If you send it out to a commercial laundry, yes, you put it in a marked bag so that when it arrives, then their exposure control plan takes over and their employees know how to handle that contaminated material. Page 25 at the bottom, we skip it. Page 26, we skip it. All of page 27, we skip it. First half of page 28, we skip it. That all has to do with research labs, so it doesn't apply to us. Middle of page 28 starts to talk about the hepatitis B vaccination. Your employer is required to provide it to you if you have exposure to bloodborne pathogens. So embalmers, apprentices, removal personnel, all of you should be offered the hepatitis B vaccination at no charge to you. I would encourage employers to offer it to everyone in their firm. Hepatitis B is now a childhood immunization. It's no longer an optional thing, that it's pretty much becoming universal. If somebody doesn't have it, they should seriously think about having it done. It talks about if you have an exposure incident on page 29, you have the right to medical attention. If you poke yourself, jab yourself, splash yourself in the eye with someone's blood, there's follow-up to be done. Your employer has to provide certain information to the physician or clinic. Labeling is talked about on page 31. The little spider looks like he's radioactive. That's the biohazard label. Page 32 and 33 talks about the annual training, what has to be covered. I've been through that, so just trust me, we're doing it. Page 34 talks about medical records. I already told employers that they need to keep your training records for 3 years. Now, if it's a record having to do with an OSHA medical related thing in the funeral home, they have to keep those records for a total of however long you work for them, plus an additional 30 years. We skip over page 35 and 36 because it has to do with, again, with those records. We come to page 37, which is the hepatitis vaccination declination, and it says mandatory. I want to make it clear that you are, if you're offered the hepatitis B vaccination, you are not required to take it. You can decline the vaccination, but there's a mandatory statement that he or she must give to you, and it's on page 37. And I would recommend employers, you just take this page and add a line, a signature and date line to it. And if you have an employee that says, I don't want the vaccination, you have them not only read this, or you read it to them, but so they understand the risks of not having it, but then you have them sign it, date it, and put it in their medical file, along with the vaccination records of those who did accept it. Now, there's 3 reasons why you may say, no, I don't want the hepatitis vaccination. Number 1, your doctor has advised you not to take it. You have something going on in your body, some type of allergy or sensitivity or some medical condition where it is contraindicated. You don't want the vaccine. Obviously, follow your doctor's advice. Number 2 would be you already had the vaccine. You maybe got it from another employer, you've switched jobs, and you simply don't have a record of it, or you've lost it or whatever, but you know you had it and you just don't see any sense in having it again, which is true. This is considered lifetime protection. Once you've had the series, the hepatitis vaccination, you don't have to go through it again. The third reason that you might say, I don't want the vaccination, is that you're an idiot. So let's turn back to page 4 now, back to our outline. And we've now covered C, and I just want to mention D. The needle stick injury law. This was some additions that were made to the bloodborne pathogen rule many years ago, and I pointed it out to you very quickly as we went through it. It requires that we have safe practices when dealing with sharps. You know, it requires the sharps container and so on. But the thing I want to remind you and employers is that on an annual basis, you are required to consider newer and safer devices. This is a case where I mentioned to you that employees must be involved. And in this rule, specifically, employees must be a part of this. Make a simple sheet of paper or chart, maybe a spreadsheet, and you name the manager or owner that's going to be involved, and a non-management employee or 2 or 3, whatever you want, to perform this consideration of newer devices. Now, you don't have to actually buy this stuff, but you can go to a safety catalog, either a real printed one or one online, and look at the stuff. Again, I don't know if my cursor's visible to you guys, but on the left corner, left upper corner, this is a disposable scalpel. It's a safer device because the blade retracts. So when you're done making your incision, you can retract the blade, lay it down, and not worry about stabbing yourself with it when you reach for something else. Are you still allowed to use that chrome or stainless steel scalpel handle that Grandpa used? Yes, you are, but you are no longer allowed, if that was ever a good idea, to grab the blade with a forceps, give it a twist, and have it pop off and fling itself across the room. And if you're chuckling right now, it's because you've been doing it. You're required to use one of these devices. It's called a safe sharps container, but it also is a blade remover. You stick the blade inside, you give it a twist, the blade pops off safely into the sharps container, and then you put on the new blade. So yes, you're allowed to do that. The next sharp thing we use is needles. I don't know that you're going to have any luck finding anything better than what you're doing. And that's simply what you mark on this sheet that you're working on to show that you did this. You say, Well, we looked online for syringes and needles, and we found this model, and you find the manufacturer and the blue one on the left side there and say, it doesn't work for us, why? Well, take a look. That needle is very short because we use these for tissue building, and it's very small. That thick stuff isn't even going to go through there. So even though it has a safety feature built in, we are not going to use it. We considered it and turned it down. That's all you need to do. Now, if you're curious, you might be able to see here a little tab sticking out at the front of the plunger, and it actually goes down into the needle itself. Give it a twist and it kind of screws itself in there, and then when you retract it, it pulls the needle back into the barrel so that when you're not using this, you can't stab yourself with the needle. It's pretty ingenious. It just doesn't work for what we do. Over on the right-hand side, you'll see some other needles. These have little flippers alongside here that will flip forward and cover the end of the needle so you won't jab yourself if you're if it's laid down next to you. And then of course it has these big plastic covers that slide over the whole thing here to protect you from poking yourself. The other violation I see in a lot of funeral homes is somebody sold you one of these, I call them ice, one of these hockey puck magnetic things, and they put a little ceramic around about the color of my background on my slides, and you put your sewing needles on them. They're illegal. They do not provide any protection from poking. They're exposing you to the possibility of wiping your hand across there and poking yourself or scraping yourself with it. So throw that thing away. I don't care how nice it looks. Your needles have to go into a container that's marked sharps. I don't care if it's a Tupperware or if it's a fancy chrome one, but it should be labeled, get a Dymo label on it. This is, sharps. And then a reminder that you don't just reach in and grab the needle, especially if the OSHA inspector's standing there. You get a forceps and remove the needle from the container with a forceps so that you don't poke yourself with it. Also, something that is not acceptable is styrofoam wig heads. Okay, somebody brought a wig in and you kept the styrofoam block around, or maybe it's an arm block, and you stuck all your sewing needles in that. That's also not acceptable. So get rid of that make do stuff and do it the right way and impress the OSHA inspector and save yourself some trouble. So in the last couple of minutes that we have, I just want to run through very quickly 10 things for employers. Make sure that you've got your paperwork done. Make sure you review them manually. We've already mentioned that. Keep your SDS sheets up to date. Make sure you've offered the hepatitis B to all your employees. Test for formaldehyde. Make sure every container is labeled, and you can assign an employee to do that. Put up the OSHA poster. In New York, last I heard, I think there's 13 different posters that need to be up. Quickest way to get those is to buy them through an office supply place. And then they all go up at the same time. Make sure you have an emergency eye wash station. That's so old we shouldn't even have to mention it, but there's a few people that try to get by with a shower or garden hose. That doesn't work, and nor do the little green bottles. Make sure you've got your training done and you've got your documentation, and make safety an everyday program. For employees, we've only got a minute or two left, but that's all I need. Take these risks seriously. Protect yourself. It's up to you to be in charge of your own safety and the safety of those that you work with. Work together. If you see something, speak up. Eliminate the hazards you can. Go to the employer with those that you can. And make sure you clean up after yourself and wash your hands. So that's what I have. If you have any questions, Kelly instructed you to type them in, and we'll take those now. If not, we will be done.
Yeah, so if you have any questions, please type them in the question box. Kurt, I did have one come in during your presentation, and it's a funeral director asking if they get a body back from the medical examiner in a body bag, and the body was not autopsied, it was just a human body that was in the body bag with no blood or medical waste. What can they do with the bag at that point?
Do with I didn't hear you, the body or the bag?
The bag.
The bag. It is considered contaminated, but it is not regulated. So if you want to reuse it, feel free to clean it up, disinfect it, and reuse it. If you want to just dispose of it, it should go into a garbage bag with the biohazard label on it, and it can go in the dumpster. Because it's considered contaminated, not regulated.
Great, thank you. At this time, I don't see any other questions, so I want to thank everyone for being on this afternoon. Again, allow 7 to 10 business days for your portal to reflect your credit. Thank you so much, Kurt, and we will speak with you in 2024. Have a good rest of your afternoon.